And okay, so they invade, and right away they're making a big push towards Mariupol, right?
So initially, on the first day, we had to relocate because the terrain we were on was unimaginable to defend properly. So we tactically relocated like day after day until we reached Mariupol on the I think it was like the last day of February, and by the 10th of March we were encircled because not only were we fighting the Russian forces that were coming from us from our previous positions, we were also fighting the Russians that were coming from behind us, that were coming from Crimea. So we knew it's only a matter of time until we're encircled. And the fighting there was very severe. Myself personally, once we got to Mariupol, I didn't do any fighting per se. I mainly helped with my unit with the ammunition and making sure the guys get what they need. And just, I think like the aerial like bombing campaign that they had on Mariupol itself was probably the hardest and heaviest I have ever seen, like in all of my knowledge of like what I've seen from like past conflicts recently. Like there isn't like a good way to describe it other than like pure hell.
Can you describe the conditions that you were in when you were trying to defend Mariupol?
So the conditions, we were in the Steelworks, and I'd say for a lot of the guys that were like manning the outer perimeter, they were in like pretty dreadful conditions, but they made the best of what they had. You know, it started to turn into a game of like cat and mouse, because every time you go above ground, it's not really a thought of like you need to get something. It's more of a thought of like, am I going to come back down? Because of the aerial bombardment. Any moment a bomb could drop. You could be seen by a drone or a jet, and most of the time you had to like rush out and not spend as much time above ground.
A lot of people talk about, Azovstal, Steelworks.
Yeah.
But there was another side as well, and this is what you were defending. Can you talk about the encirclement of Azovstal?
So for people who don't know, there was 3 major holdout points in the city once the Russian forces had infiltrated the city. There was the Steelworks, which is where I was located, which is like north of the city. And then you've got Azovstal, which was southeast. And then there was also the port, which is southwest. And eventually, when the Russians started pushing into the city, we ended up getting cut off from the holdout in Azovstal. So now the Russians had completely encircled the Steelwork territory, and the Steelworks themselves, it's like a mini city, so to speak, because of how big it is and how big the buildings are. And by this point, it's like the 10th of April. We've like run out of food. We've got plenty of water, but no food. And we attempted to try and make a break and fight our way to Zaporizhia the night before. And when it got cancelled, reasons unknown, but the next morning, the Russians were able to locate the vehicles that we had prepared and loaded all our ammunition into. And somehow they managed to like get exact point where it was hidden in the factory, and all our ammunition got destroyed. Obviously, after this had happened, we had no ammunition whatsoever to fight with. And due to like the heavy casualties we were taking because of the aerial bombardment, we had no other choice than to like surrender. So by this point, we're now in a second encirclement. There's no way for us to get to Azovstal, and surrender was either surrender or end up who knows what.
So was there ever a moment where you thought you might not make it out alive?
I would say there was definitely a few moments, but it's hard to put into like words, because generally when you get fear, like you normally have that sense of like try to avoid it, but at the same time, like when you're there and everything's going on around you, you kind of like just learn to accept it, and you try to carry on like whatever work it is you're doing.
Let's talk about the moments where you understood that you have to surrender. Can you talk about this? How did you know it was time to surrender?
So initially, the commander like told us that we either have like three options that we can try and attempt to like break out in whatever was left of the vehicles. Initially, I turned that down straight away just because I knew it would be pretty much impossible to drive 140 kilometers through enemy territory, especially the encirclement, to get through that. The second option was to try and walk out on foot, and I was more leaning to that. But then I asked like how many people are like leaving on foot, and they said quite a lot. And given the size of our territory and the encirclement, I figured that wouldn't be an option just because it would just be pretty much suicide. And then the third option was to surrender officially to Russian forces alongside those who are surrendering and the injured. So I chose to do that one because that way at least I looked at it as maybe like a 90% chance that they kill me, or there's that 10% chance that I survive it. And I also knew as well that those who surrendered with me would see me. I knew there would be witnesses to see that I surrendered. They saw that I was alive, because that 90% of me thinking that they would kill me, I also thought that they would just do a lot of stuff to like basically kill me.
Why'd you think that they would kill you?
So I've learned and studied a lot about like Russian conflicts. I've studied, like I've done a lot of research into Georgia, Chechnya, and Moldova, and then also Syria. And the history with the treatment of POWs has never been good. So I kind of had an idea of what might be waiting for me, especially with myself being a foreigner. I've like researched and studied a lot of like Russian propaganda over the years because of my time in military service, and I've learned that Russian state propaganda, it's only got one objective: to throw as many narratives out into the world to confuse people. So I knew that they would be calling it all sorts of stuff. They'd previously like called us in a propaganda piece in 2020. Saying all kinds of like crazy like conspiracy sort of stuff. And it wasn't until when we were preparing to go to the surrender point that my mind was just completely empty, devoid of like emotion or feeling. And I'd accepted that this was most likely my fate. But again, I was holding on to hope of that 10%, like that I will survive it and go home at some point. So before we did go, I managed to make a call to my family through the Starlink, luckily, and told my mum what was about to happen. I lied to her, said like, everything's going to be fine, don't worry. I'm sure she couldn't worry, like after I've just told her I'm going to be going into Russian captivity of all places. And then called my then fiance, who I've since split up with, called her to tell her like what's going to happen. Also lied to her that everything will be fine. And then once that had happened, took all my electronics, destroyed them, and then I scattered them around so that the Russians couldn't piece them back together to get access to my electronics. So it was probably like one of the most terrifying like situations that I've ever experienced and will experience.